The test will be graded this week, and we'll get them back to you. We'll hand them back physically after the lecture next week. The grades will go to Blackboard before then. What other housekeeping things? I don't think there's a reading response to this ebook for a few weeks. I've heard that already in your tutorial, but there are tutorials still. So please make sure you go do your tutorial tomorrow, and I'll be posting the source readings for the next few weeks today, so you can get those before your tutorial. Although you've already read the readings for today, so it'll be for the following lecture that'll be going on soon. So, in the time I have remaining today, I just want to talk a little bit about Sui and Tang China. So, this is the chart I keep on building on, and now we've gone through 3 of the major dynasties of Chinese civilization: the Zhou, the Han Dynasty, and the Tang. So these 3 are considered sort of the great grand dynasties of Chinese culture. The Zhou, the sort of beginnings of Chinese culture and the Confucian classics and so forth. The Han Dynasty, the first long-lasting empire, which then broke up into 3 kingdoms and 6 dynasties, reunited by the Sui, and then the next sort of long-lasting, glorious dynasty is the Tang, which we'll get to today. So we're still in this period of empire and chaos going back and forth. There'll be no surprise that the Tang itself will start falling apart and break up into a 5 dynasties period. So, I want to talk a little bit about the Sui dynasty first. It was the dynasty that managed to reunite North and South China. So it was based, the Sui came from a family, the Yang family, who were in the north part of China, one of the northern kingdoms, which generally the north part of China, which was largely under non-Chinese rule, but also had Chinese families up there as well. Both those groups were much more military in their orientation, much more Wu, martial, than the area in the south of China, the southern dynasties, based in around the Yangtze River, with capital at Nanjing, or again known as Jinling or Jiantang. So it was the Sui that managed to conquer the last of the southern dynasties, the Shun dynasty in 581, and reunited both north and south of China. But then the Sui in turn was conquered in 618. It didn't last very long, and then the Tang sort of built upon Sui's achievements to build a long-lasting empire. Very similar to the pattern of the Qin uniting all the warring states, laying a foundation for the empire, physical infrastructure, and then the Han Dynasty building on top of that. A very sort of similar thing happened. Why did the Sui not last very long? A few reasons. The first emperor, Sui Wenji, built a huge navy to control the Yangtze River, because he figured the Yangtze River was the key to uniting North and South China, because that was a natural barrier that often broke up North and South China. So he put a lot of money into that. He captured Nanjing, the southern capital, and sort of razed it to the ground, and forced all the aristocratic families to move back to the north, back to the homeland, the heartland of Chinese culture, around the Yellow River, the Chang'an and Luoyang region. But he realized the economic importance of the south, and so he built a huge canal to link the 2 rivers. The Yellow River's up here, and the Yangtze River's down here, so he built a canal system to link the 2 of them, which is a massive undertaking, and tens of thousands of people died building it. And then, not only was it he sort of redid all the roads and the whole transportation network, but as well he started a civil service examination to recruit people to serve in the capital, in the court, and as well as to serve as officials throughout the empire. So all of these achievements, the infrastructure, transportation, as well as the examination system, were built upon later by the Tang Dynasty. But the reason the Sui didn't last very long is they were very ambitious militarily. So you can see the height of Sui territory actually goes all the way down here into modern-day Vietnam, pushes into Central Asia along the Silk Road here, and they spent a lot of effort and time and resources trying to conquer Goguryeo, which was the northern kingdom of the 3 kingdoms in Korea at the time. I think at least four separate expeditions were sent against Goguryeo, and none of them were successful. And that was a key, actually, element in the downfall of the Sui dynasty. They just depleted themselves militarily. And then the last emperor, Sui Yangji was his name, was given to extravagant shows of his power and luxury. There are tales of how he had an entire navy. Instead of using regular canvas for the sails, he used silk brocade. You can imagine the money and effort that went into outfitting a navy with silk brocade sails. He apparently liked fireflies, so he supposedly collected all the fireflies off an entire mountain and then had them released in the palace for his enjoyment. So when you're doing things like that, the people that are struggling along don't take too kindly to it. So his dynasty didn't last so long. So between the warfare and his incompetence, the dynasty fell. And as always, what happens is when things are rotting at the top that way, power devolves away from the center towards the provinces. Well, there weren't provinces at the time, the districts. And so you had local officials all over the empire starting to consolidate their own power and just waiting for the Sui dynasty to fall. And two of them, men by the name of Li, the Li clan, Li Yuan and his son Li Shimin, emerged as the founder and the builder of the new Tang dynasty. Akin to sort of Emperor Wu and Emperor Wen, the Zhou, sort of one emperor sort of founds the dynasty and then the next one builds upon it. And one of the first things they did when they conquered the Sui and established themselves as a dynasty, the first emperor is known as Gao Fu, and then his son is known as Taibo. And this is the extent of the Tang territory here, which is similar to the Sui. One of the first things they did was to promulgate a code of law, a systematic code of law for the entire empire. And that actually became the template for the legal system throughout East Asia. So it actually traveled to Vietnam, Korea, and Japan as well, used as a model for establishing codes of law throughout East Asia. They retained a sort of presence of farmer soldiers that they used along the northern frontier. So they sent people out there to farm along the north, and as well trained them as soldiers. And so for part of the year they would serve in the army, and the rest of the year they would farm. So they kind of had a standing army to defend themselves from the northern border people. They redistributed land. This was done early on in the Tang Dynasty in a more sort of equitable land distribution system, which sort of got people behind them. And then they built upon this examination system that the Sui dynasty started. This is a picture from the Qing dynasty, the Qing dynasty examination, but I thought I'd put it up there as a sort of illustration of what I'm talking about, which is scholars or wannabe officials from all over the empire would write a series of examinations, first local ones, and then provincial ones, and then they go to the capital and write one in the capital. And each time you pass, you would go on to the next one. If you pass the final one in the capital, you could win a job in the court, a high position as an official. So it was sort of a major path to official employment in the Tang Dynasty. The examinations actually tested a knowledge of classics as well as your ability to write poetry. I don't know how relevant that was to being an official, but it did cause an explosion of poetic writing in the Tang Dynasty. I'll talk a little bit about that. The influence of the Xianbei that was strong in the Han Dynasty sort of faded and were replaced by the Turkish people coming out of Central Asia. And the Tang royal house actually allied themselves with these Turkish people, the Uyghurs, and used them to help protect their frontiers against other people, to help protect the caravan trading routes along the Silk Road. And some Turkish generals actually became quite powerful as military leaders within the Chinese Empire itself. And there are even some rumors that there was some Turkish blood in the Li royal family itself. And there's another famous Li Bai poet. Some people say he might have some Turkish blood too. So there's a very intimate connection between Central Asia and the Chinese ruling house at the time. The Tang did manage to get hold of Goguryeo for a little while, the northern Korean kingdom that Sui was trying to get a hold of, but they did lose it to another Korean kingdom by the name of Shilla, and I'll talk about that next week. What else should I say about the Tang? It's notable for being the first time that a woman actually sat on the emperor's throne and ruled as an emperor. So Empress Wu was not just married to an emperor, but actually sat on the throne and declared herself emperor. and she reigned from 690 to 705 as Emperor of China. She renamed the dynasty the Zhou dynasty after the original Zhou dynasty, but people, later historians don't acknowledge it as a valid, legitimate dynasty, probably because she's a woman. And so they still call it the Tang, and consider that as sort of an interruption, minor interruption of the Tang. But she had a great deal of cultural influence while she sat on the throne. One thing that some of you who have been to China may have seen are these Buddha statues in the Wongmen Caves near Luoyang. They're fantastic. I actually had another picture here. They go on, I don't know, probably a kilometer or so along a river. In the side of a cliff, all thousands of Buddhas are carved, and this was started under Empress Wu, who was a great patron of Buddhism. She also had a Buddha carved in her own likeness, so supposedly what she looks like there. So you can go see that as well. And she effectively ruled China for about actually 50 years, even though her dynasty only lasted for about 15. She really was in power for about 50 years. She also made great use of the examination system because she was not part of the Li aristocratic family. She was married into it. She was felt threatened by the other aristocratic families, and so in order to break their power, she used the examination system even more to try and bring people up from outside the aristocratic families into office. So she tried to make it a more meritocratic sort of system and spread the power of officials beyond the major aristocratic families. She's also put Taoist texts on the examination as well and expanded the curriculum and did quite a bit of innovative things in her time. As I said, the examination system tested literary talent as part of one of the skills, and so poetry became a sort of part of daily life of officials or even people who wanted to become officials. And you sort of had the rise of a class of mostly men called literati, people who define themselves by their knowledge and talent and literature and culture. And poetry actually became a kind of form of social advancement. I'll talk a little bit more about poetry later, but first I want to talk about the different regions of the Tang Empire. So there's a map of it there, and there are sort of three regions that come up in politics, they come up in the histories, and they come up in painting and poetry as well. These are sort of culturally marked regions. The first is the frontiers, so along the north and into Central Asia. So a lot of military commanders and military training going into protecting these frontiers and maintaining these frontiers and these trading routes. A lot of poetry written on the frontier. The whole association of the frontier is something that's very martial, sort of masculine and military. And this contrasts with the Southland, which continue to have this association of being more feminine, sensual, and hedonistic in their outlook. And these are the lands below the Yangtze River. So the sort of legacy of the six dynasties, the dynasties fixated on cultural production rather than the northern ones who were fixated more on military affairs. That kind of legacy continues to be associated with the Southland. And then between them is the capital, which started out in Chang'an, although Luoyang is a kind of secondary capital that was used at times. And the capital also has association of its own sort of culture of elegance and refinement and power, of course. So you keep these sort of regions in mind when you're thinking about China. And this capital is extremely important. Chang'an, which is in the same place the modern-day Xi'an is in. There's a map of it there. I don't know how clear that is. This is a really good resource here, this website. You go here in English, but it's based on all sorts of scholarship that is coming out of China and Japan on reconstructing Chang'an. And you can go through, I tried to pull it up, but I wasn't able to do it. You go through a sort of three-dimensional reconstruction of the city and walk through it and get a sort of first-person point of view going through the city of Chang'an. It was started by the Sui dynasty, then expanded by the Tang dynasty. And you can see here it's sort of built on a grid system. It's sort of an early, one of the, I don't know if it's the first city built on a grid system or not, but it's a very sort of modern way of conceiving of the city, rather than the sort of winding paths that normally cities grow up organically around paths for horses and so forth. This was a planned city from the beginning. on a grid that was divided into 108 separate rectangular wards. And each of those wards had a wall around it that had a gate that could be locked up, so the entire city could be locked down, and was locked down in the evening when there was a curfew to increase security. The best estimates say that past about 2 million people lived not only within the walls of Chang'an, but immediately around it in the area, even in Han time. So this is a huge cosmopolitan city. And it is truly cosmopolitan. There were Christians, Nestorian Christians living there, Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, Jewish people, Islamic people, everyone from all over the sort of world, or the Eastern Hemisphere at least, ended up in Chang'an. And so as you can imagine, it was a kind of hotbed of foreign fashions and foreign music, which fundamentally changed a lot of Chinese culture. So there's a strong strain of Central Asian music that became part of Chinese music, as well as typical Tang textiles and dress and hairstyles and so forth that you'll see often have a Central Asian influence as well. There are famous dances, whirling dervishes and so forth that became very popular in the Tang. And it really was, Chang'an was the end of the Silk Road. It was the sort of destination, the sort of eastern end of the Silk Road. So everything that was coming along the Silk Road in terms of culture, knowledge, religion, as well as merchandise and products, all ended up there. And then from there, moved back out and stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. So the shores of the Mediterranean to Chang'an were connected by the Silk Road. And so this sort of glorious city and this glorious dynasty reached its height in the early 8th century with a Tang emperor by the name of Xuanzong, who reigned from 712 to 755. And there's a Chinese saying which is Le Ji Sheng Bei, which is at the height of joy comes sorrow. I'm getting ahead of myself here, which is anytime you reach the height of something, sure enough it's going to turn around and start going downhill again. But I got ahead of myself, sorry. Before I talk about the demise of the Tang, I want to talk about the accomplishments in terms of poetry. Give you just a taste of that, because poetry was such an important part of the life of the elite class and the officials and anyone that wanted to become part of that elite class, that there was a huge explosion in poetic production. So I just wanted to give you one example of a famous poet by the name of Wang Wei, who was very much from the aristocratic family. The Wang clan was one of the aristocratic clans in the Tang Dynasty. And was imbued with court culture, but sort of tried to reject the refinement and sort of elegance and ornamentation of court culture in favor of a more simpler attitude towards life that he found in Buddhism, and the acknowledgement that we talked about briefly when we talked about Buddhism, that all reality is really emptiness. So a key element of his poetry is it builds a surface image, but below that surface image you'll get a sense of the emptiness of reality and kind of an insight into that. And he does that by balancing very carefully different techniques of stasis and motion, sight and sound. And many people say his poems are like beautiful paintings, except paintings which lead you to an awareness of the emptiness behind the surface. He was a famous painter as well, but unfortunately none of his paintings survived. We have one stone etching of supposedly stone carving that was an imitation of one of his paintings, but that's it. Most of the paintings were done in silk at the time. So they didn't survive. So I wanted to give you just a quick taste of how this works in a poem here. It's a very famous poem by Wang Wei called Stopping by the Temple of Infant Mass. So I'll do a very poor rendition in Chinese of the poem so you can hear what it sounds like, and then I'll talk a little bit about how it's put together. So, 不知象棋寺，数里入云峰。 无目无人惊，圣善何处踪？泉声也为实，日色冷清松。国物同堂曲，安常至玉龙。My second applause. Okay, so this it has some rhyme to it. You might have heard me say feng and zhong and song and long. So this is a sort of strict rule that these poems have to rhyme according to a certain rhyme scheme. And what you probably didn't hear is the tones actually have to balance. So there's a euphony, which we've come across with someone who are actually chanting it better than I do in the poem. And then the third sort of rule that you have to follow are these elements of parallelism. So you'll notice here, I knew not as a temple of incense mass, I went several miles in the cloudy peaks. He's introducing this idea of looking for this temple. And then he developed that idea. Ancient trees, trails with no one there, deep in hills enveloped from I knew not where. So you get a vision of what he sees as he searches for this temple in the mountain. But notice how carefully it's parallel. Ancient trees, deep hills, gumu, shanshan. Even the adjective and the nouns are parallel. Trails with no one there, enveloped from I knew not where. And then once he's sort of developed that idea, he gives you a sort of twist. So stream sounds choked on steep pitched stones and hues of sunlight were chilled by green pines. And so suddenly he's aware of the sights and sounds. This is balancing sight and sound, it's balancing stasis from motion. And that turning in this third couplet leads them to an insight, right? A conclusion. Towards dusk at the bend of the deserted pool and meditation's calm, I mastered passion's dragon. Literally the poison dragon in the Chinese, the Buddhist term meaning the passions and attachments you have to the world which lead to your suffering. And the idea of meditating, Chan, is to calm those passions so you can cease your suffering. And he finds a moment to do that just by sitting by this pool after having apprehended nature in sight and sound. He realizes he does not need to find the temple of incense mass, but the mountain itself becomes a temple for him. You can meditate there by the pool. So you can, the reason I'm showing you this poem is I want you to notice how exquisitely crafted it is. It appears very natural, but at the same time there's a lot of practice going into it in order to present it with a certain picture that's actually a highly controlled picture. And the Tom, by the time it reached its high point, and every culture does this when they reach a zenith, a self-perceived zenith, they think that they know everything, right? That they've got all the answers, everything's in properly ordered the way it's supposed to be, and they can just, coast from there on in. And that's kind of what was happening in the Tong by the time Longwei was writing. And we got to the High Tong with this emperor. Oops, there's more here. Emperor Shenzong. And so Chang'an reaches its height under Emperor Shenzong. The sort of Chinese culture reaches this zenith in terms of poetry and painting, and Buddhist religion is flourishing at this time, as well as Taoism. Everything's going along pretty well, and then it all starts to fall apart under reign of Emperor Shenzong. And there's a very famous story about that, which resonates throughout all later Chinese dynasties. And it's a very famous story not only in China, but it travels to Korea and Japan as well. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And it starts out as a love story. Emperor Shenzong falls in love with a woman who comes to be known as Yang Wei-fei, a treasured concubine, Yang. And she was actually, according to the historical account, was the concubine of one of his sons. And he saw her bathing and liked her and said, you know what, I'll take her for myself, and took her away from his son, which technically you're not supposed to do, but he's the emperor, so I guess he went ahead and did that. And fell in love with her, and supposedly she had such power over him that she was able to convince him to raise a lot of her male relatives to high positions at court, including to raise her own uncle, Yang Guozhong, to the highest position of prime minister in the land. And that, people grumbled about that, about the influence that the Yang family had over Emperor Shenzong. But one person in particular was very upset about that, was a Turkish general by the name of An Lushan. You can tell he's Turkish there because of all his beard and mustache and big nose and everything. These are all later drawings. An Lushan was a general who worked for the emperor, who had a sort of military commander in the northwest part of China, and was also quite close to the emperor. So the emperor, sort of in his palace, was quite close to Yang Wei-fei, but in terms of running the empire in military terms, An Lushan was kind of his right hand man. Supposedly An Lushan was quite fat, and had a big pot belly. And one time, Emperor Shenzong stopped him and said, "What are you keeping in that big belly of yours?" And he said, "Only a heart loyal to you, Your Majesty," which was, of course, the right answer. So he was also gifted at flattery as well. And so he got very upset that all this power was going to the Yang family through the influence of Yang Wei-fei. Apparently, this influence was so great that people started singing ditties in the street. We have history that Chinese historians love collecting folk songs, things that people are singing in the street as a sort of a sign of the times and often as a prophecy. And supposedly folk songs were going around about how it's no longer good to have a boy, you now want to have a girl because girls can become as powerful as Yang Guifei. So this was something that was very sort of well known in the culture. So this tension broke out between the Yang clan and An Lushan, and An Lushan actually became so threatened that he was going to lose power that he decided to take power for himself. So he got his army together and he conquered first Luoyang, and then he came and conquered Chang'an, the capital, under the pretense of saving, quote unquote, the emperor from the influence of the Yang clan. But the emperor realized what was happening, that An Lushan was making a bid for power for himself, to become emperor himself, and so he fled the capital, and he went to a place called Shu, which is modern-day Sichuan, which is under the kingdom of Shu in the War and Peace period, which is where emperors often fled to because it's surrounded by mountains, and once you held off the path, you had a very sort of secure place to stay. So the emperor had, at that point, only sort of palace guard, a small army to protect him. All the other forces were trying to fight against An Lushan and losing. And so he left the capital, and about, I think, 100 miles west of the capital, they said he came to a place called Mawei, where they stopped to rest their horses. And the emperor's army said, we will no longer continue to protect you unless you execute Yang Guozhong, the uncle, because they blamed Yang Guozhong as the one of stirring up the jealousy of An Lushan. And the emperor said, sure, no problem. He had Yang Guozhong executed. And then they said, well, actually, it's because of Yang Guifei that got into this whole mess, because her influence over you is what's Yang Guozhong in the power, so you need to put her to death as well. And the emperor said, no, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that. And so there's all sorts of famous poems and stories and plays about this critical moment in Chinese history. And there are different accounts of it. But one account says that Yang Guifei herself kept on telling the emperor, this is for the good of the empire, I need to be put to death if the empire is to continue, otherwise An Lushan will conquer everything. Whoever convinced him, eventually someone convinced the emperor that Yang Guifei should be put to death. And one account says that she was hanged by the neck by a silken cord from a tree. Another account says she was laid out upon the ground and covered with a silken brocade blanket and trampled by horses. However, what happened, she was put to death there. And the emperor was heartbroken. He fled to Shu. The loyalist forces eventually conquered An Lushan, but the emperor never wanted to sit on the throne again. His son became the next emperor of the Tang Dynasty. And so this tragic story became sort of an integral part of Chinese culture at that point. It became a story that traveled to other cultures as well. Don't have much time, so I'm going to do some editing here. Other cultural achievements in the Tang, Buddhist statuary and painting, music, material culture, ceramics are a big one. Many of those have survived because of the nature of ceramics, they endure. And if you go to any museum, including the ROM, you can see all sorts of wonderful examples of Tang ceramics, including those three-colored horses, which are very famous from that time. In terms of literary production, poetry, and prose writing as well, became extremely popular. So some of the most famous poets of Chinese history are from the Tang. These are slides, I'm not going to go over them now. When I post them, you can look at them at your leisure. Li Bai is probably the most famous of Chinese poets. He was very popular in the Tang Dynasty. And then Du Fu, often considered China's greatest poet, almost as famous as Li Bai, but not quite as outgoing and interesting. And Li Bai was very much a sort of flamboyant drunk. Du Fu was much more serious. But the reason I want to talk about Du Fu is he wrote a famous poem about the An Lushan rebellion. So I'm using poetry as a source for history here for you today. This is called The View in Spring. A kingdom smashed, its hills and rivers still here. The Chinese is Wu Po, Shan He Dai. So 5 characters, and Du Fu captures the entire zeitgeist of the time, right? That the kingdom lies smashed, and yet nature persists eternally around it. Spring in the city, plants and trees grow deep. Moved by the moment, flowers splash with tears, alarms at parting, birds startle the heart. In this translation that Stephen Owen did, he's trying to capture what Du Fu does in his original Chinese lines is a fusion of the emotions of the poet with the scene around him. So you're not sure who's crying, is it the flowers or is it the poet? You're not sure whose hearts are startled, is it the bird or is it the poet or is it both? Who doesn't make those choices for you in the original, and so you don't have to make them. War's beacon fires have gone on 3 months, letters from home are worth thousands of gold, fingers run through white hair until it's thin, half pins will almost no longer hold. So this was writing about not being able to serve as an official anymore because the dynasty is crumbling around him. One response to this, you've read it in your the various source books, I won't go over the details here, was this figure from after the Alishan Rebellion, when the Tang Dynasty was reestablished, and the Alishan was defeated. One of the most famous literary and cultural figures is by the name of Han Yu, and he asked, what went wrong? What went wrong with the Tang Dynasty that we almost lost everything? This greatest dynasty in the world almost was, we lost it to this one Turkish general. And he looked into the Chinese culture, and he felt that the Chinese culture had lost a sense of its roots in its past, and particularly in the Confucian classics. And he particularly thought that people were too concerned with writing in beautiful ways, writing beautiful poetry and writing very fancy prose, and not communicating, ideas clearly. And so he actually went back to the works of Sima Qian, the historical records that we talked about briefly, held that up as an example of clear, utilitarian writing that should be imitated. He went back to even Mencius as an example of clear writing with strong Confucian values. And part of his attempt to, it's called Pinggu in Chinese, to revive the past, to make the past values live again, is to protect them against foreign influence. And so Han Yu identified Buddhism as a sort of baneful foreign influence. And this is an important point in Chinese culture because it's sort of the first time where you see Chinese culture defining itself in opposition to another culture, in this case, Buddhism. Up to this point, Buddhism was sort of part of Chinese culture. It had been there for centuries already. There was a vast network of temples and monks and nuns living all over the place, and it was just part of everyone's daily life. But Han Yu started to identify it as this foreign element. And he picked this key moment in which the Tang emperor himself was supposed to welcome the actual Shinbo of the historical Buddha, supposedly was preserved somewhere, was being brought to China. They were going to build a huge pagoda to house the Shinbo, and the emperor himself was going to worship it. And this, drove Han Yu crazy. And so he wrote this memorial, a very famous memorial about how the emperor should be doing this. And he was sentenced to death, actually, for writing this memorial, because in it he claims that the emperor does this, the emperor himself will not live very long, the emperor's family will not stay in the throne very long, so it was considered a seditious sentiment. He has some friends at court that had that sentence commuted to exile. They ended up going to Chaozhou in the south and survived for a bit longer. But you can look at that as it's a beautifully written piece in terms of rhetoric. And it's written in the clear, straightforward manner that he was advocating himself, this old-style prose. Yeah, there's the term there, old prose. There are a few famous female poets. Perhaps the most famous one in the Tang Dynasty was Yu Xuanzi. Here's an interesting quatrain she wrote on seeing the male scholars pass examinations and have their names posted as having passed examinations, and feeling resentment that she never would be able to see her name up there because as a woman she was not allowed to take examinations. So it's a very sort of frank expression of that resentment in the very form that the men are mastering, which she also mastered, this form of poetry. She was a Taoist nun, and often nuns, Buddhist or Taoist nuns, had more social mobility than Chinese women who were married into official families who were not actually supposed to leave the house without male escorts. The Taoist nuns could mix more freely. She was actually part of a circle of poets that included men as well. And one more cultural highlight that I should leave you with is a site called Dunhuang, which is at the far west, way out here in Gansu province along the Silk Road, which is a major stop along the Silk Road. The reason it's important not only is this huge complex of Buddhist caves that were sort of painted all these beautiful motifs. But as well, they discovered a cache of about 13,500 paper scrolls like this, with a huge depository of literature, philosophy, even military texts, accounts. A huge sort of cross-section of daily life on the frontier was preserved in these scrolls. It's an excellent source for popular culture to balance the elite culture that comes out of the capital, which is mostly what we get. So it's nice to have this other sort of cache of materials to look at. This one here is a particularly famous one. This is a copy of the Diamond Sutra, one of the Buddhist sutras, and it's the world's first printed book. It was printed in 868, and it was done not with a printing press per se, not with individual letters or characters, but the entire page would be carved out of one block of wood, and then the entire page would be pressed into that one block. But it's the first printed book in the world, and it was given away free. It was in the public domain, because the more you communicated the sutra to other people, the more you brought the word of the Buddha to others, and the more karma you would have for yourself. And so I should say, I guess in closing, the Tang Dynasty ended much the same way the Han Dynasty ended, which was eunuchs and officials were having factional struggles in the center, in the capital, and military power devolved away to military governors, and left a very tenuous situation, which all it took, once again, was a famine, natural disaster, to bring about a rebellion. And one rebel by the name of Huang Chao was able to raise his own army. He was a rich, salt merchant, and he was able to raise his own army, and he laid waste to much of the land, and he captured Chang'an. And after that, the dynasty fell, broke up into the five kingdoms, the five dynasties. The Tang is important not only for being one of the great glorious dynasties of Chinese civilization, but it set a cultural, political, even legal template that was borrowed and adapted by the Korean and Japanese kingdoms at the time for their own purposes. And it's around the time of the Tang Dynasty that we see a reliable written record coming out of what we now call Korea, what we now call Japan. So next week I'll be turning to the beginnings of written civilization in Korea and Japan. So please go to your tutorial tomorrow, and keep a look out at Blackboard for your source readings for the following week.